we are live, and welcome to this discussion between Joan and Victoria Lee for their book, A Lesson in Vengeance. I'm Carter, I use they, them pronouns, and I am the event coordinator here at Astoria Bookshop, the bookshop hosting this event. If you don't know who we are because you found us through the magic of the internet, we are a bookshop in Astoria, Queens, a borough in New York City. This event is a part of our programming for our bookshop's 8th birthday celebration. So if you do live in the area, be sure to come on by and visit us today at 4 p.m. when Victoria Lee will be signing books with us. We're doing a hybrid thing right now, so virtual for this, in person for that. So be sure to stop by. Before we get started, I want to go through just a few housekeeping things. You will have the opportunity to ask questions during the last 15-ish minutes of this. If you have questions throughout, put them in the question function. You can also chat with each other over there on the right, where I know a lot of you have been saying hi to each other. Feel free to continue to do that. But we will kick you out if you participate in any trolling, any racial, ethnic, or homophobic slurs. Basically, we ask that you be nice and respectful towards one another. Finally, there is a button right down there at the bottom that offers the option to buy a signed copy of Victoria Lee's book. Victoria is one of our local signing authors, so she will come in, sign a book, personalize it, write a note to you, put a smiley face on it. I don't know what you want. If that's what you want, be sure to note that. But yeah, she comes in, she can write your name at the top, all of that. So be sure to grab yours before the end of the event or pop in at 4 p.m., as I said before. So let's get things started, and I'll introduce both of these fantastic authors. So Victoria Lee uses they, she, and he pronouns, grew up in Durham, North Carolina, where she spent her childhood writing ghost stories and fantasizing about attending boarding school. She has a PhD in psychology, which they use to overanalyze fictional characters and also herself. Lee is the author of A Lesson in Vengeance, as well as The Fever King and its sequel, The Electric Heir. She lives in New York City with her partner, Kat, and malevolent dog. Visit her online at victorialeewrites.com and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at SoSadVictoria. Joan uses she, her pronouns and was born and raised in Philadelphia, but still, on occasion, loses her way. At a young age, she received classical instruction in oil painting before discovering that stories were her favorite kind of art. She studied psychology and Chinese history at the University of Pennsylvania and currently writes from a desk overlooking the city waterfront. She is the New York Times bestselling author of The Ones We're Meant to Find and Descendant of the Crane, her young adult debut novel. So welcome both of you, and I'll let you two take over.
Thank you so much, Carter. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited to be talking to Victoria about A Lesson in Vengeance. This is my first time moderating, actually, so please forgive me if I'm, super awkward, but I'm actually so excited, and I'm so worried about, spoiling this book because I want to talk to Victoria about everything that, went down in this book that surprised me so much, but I know I have to refrain from spoilers, so I will try my best. Victoria, let's start off this by probably a question that you've been asked a ton already, but I want to know personally, what was your inspiration behind writing this book?
So basically, me and a friend were okay. So first off, I love The Secret History of Donna Tartt. I actually have 6 copies of it on my shelf behind me as we speak. I am very deeply invested in that book, especially in Henry Winter. And a friend and I kind of bonded over the fact that we both liked dark academia and we liked Donna Tartt's work. And one day we were talking about what do you think it would have been like to go to school with her? Because we found this article that was talking about how Donna was always wearing suits, just fully dressed, looking had the drip constantly, and how even at 4 a.m. you would go into her room and she would be sitting there in a pinstriped suit with collar studs and a bow tie, and I was just what? Okay, so I really wanted to write a character like that, and we're talking about oh, I bet like this is all based in reality for her. Like she probably like was out there like killing people at her school and writing about it in the secret history. And yeah, so it really just started from like wanting to write about like somebody who's very passionate about literature and like about dark academia kind of like through the lens of writing, which, you know, is an art that I feel like straddles academia and art a lot of the time. Obviously, like the book ended up becoming super different from that original conversation. It took on a life of its own, but originally it was a draft on my computer called Murderous Lesbian Donna Tartt because of that conversation.
I love that. I mean,
Donna Tartt, Sophia. I feel like I have to say that all like similarities between people, like real people in the book, is coincidental and like completely accidental.
well, I have not actually read The Secret History, forgive me. I only have some friends who've read it who love it, but it's funny that you mentioned that because as I was reading this book, I obviously like I had all the elements of like young adult that I love, especially like the friendships and kind of like the just coming into yourself and growing into yourself, but it also had really strong what I felt were like crossover elements. And again, while I've not read Donna Tartt, and I know you comp it to Ninth House, which I also have not read, I'm sorry, but it really gave me like a lot of like night film vibes and like
I love night film.
yeah, that was such oh my god, that book I still think about all the time. But it gave me like night film vibes because like kind of like I feel like filmmaking and like writing, they're both kind of like art aspects, and we can talk about like the method of it later. But it also gave me like women in the window vibes, mainly because you have like a really awesome passage that I'm going to actually read out later about like mental health and how it can be used to especially through the lens of women to like introduce confusion in the narrative. But I guess my question is like all these books I mentioned, like again, they're like adult and they really gave me these adult thriller vibes. So was it your intention to write something crossover from the start, or was that something that you kind of built in as you were writing the book and revising it?
Yeah, honestly, I feel like so much of my stuff that I write naturally gravitates toward crossover. Like if new adult were a genre, I think I would write like exclusively in new adult. Like that's like where I feel comfortable. Like I want to write about like older teens in mature situations, or like young like college age adults, like, you know, who are kind of in this cusp of like they sort of know themselves, but they're sort of still like discovering things about themselves and like having a coming of age and dealing with like challenging adult situations that a lot of teens do in fact like have to deal with. And so like for this, like it's YA, but I think that it does kind of straddle that line, and that was intentional, mostly to the degree that like everything I write kind of is in that space, or like either shelf. I've heard people say like, "Oh, this should have been set in college," and frankly, like, yeah, that would have been great if like YA allowed us to do that. Like, this could easily have been set in college, and it would have been like the same book, right? So it's definitely on purpose. Slash, it's hard to say like on purpose. It's not like I sat down, I was like, I'm gonna write a crossover book. I just always sit down.
Yeah, that makes sense. I totally understand that because I feel like I kind of also have the same thing where like I feel like when I write teens, they're not necessarily like the way you would think of teens, but to me they're still teenagers because like they still are questioning like who they are and how they fit in the world, and they worry a lot about how they are perceived. But I feel like the age of a character isn't necessarily defined by, you know, if they're in like high school or even like the first year of college, right? And it's more by like their internal journey, which brings me to something I really want to ask you about. So like you have a PhD in psychology. For those of you who didn't know, yeah, Victoria, I think you mentioned like it was social psychology that you focused on.
It was social psychology, and I had like a specialization in cognitive neuroscience.
It's so cool. Yeah, I have a BA in psychology, so I kind of like dropped out before like it got to like your stage, which is super admirable. But I really felt that when I was reading the book, I just felt like you had such a good grasp of like the characters and not only how they presented like across to the reader, which I feel like takes a lot of skill, like understanding how the reader is going to perceive a character, but also how they navigated their own relationships with each other. So I want to ask, like, how much do you think, like, and what roles did your psychology background play into this book? And did you ever think, like, oh, this is like, for example, like psychopaths in psychology, like, is that something that you're like, I love this subject and I want to incorporate it into the characters somehow?
Oh, definitely, like on multiple levels. Like, I think just even in terms of like craft, like if you're thinking about like the psychology of narratives and like when people expect things to happen and when you want to uphold that expectation versus subvert it, like that's definitely one way in which it can come into play. But like much more obviously, I think, yeah, with the characters and like having a internally consistent, like coherent view in your head of like their logic and their motivations and their wants and like what drives them and when would they do something that might surprise the reader but like upon reflection be completely consistent with their character. And in terms of psychopathy, like I actually studied psychopathy in grad school as like one of my research areas, so like that's always been something that's interesting for me to write about because there's so many different ways that psychopathy can present. Like it's not just like Hannibal Lecter. Like there are psychopaths who like never hurt anybody. All they just do is like vibe in their mom's basement and play video games. Like and the reason that it's like psychopathic is because it's like a parasitic behavior. Like they have these other like, you know, personality traits like kind of hang together and like become psychopathy. But like it's definitely not just like Hannibal Lecter or like I don't know, any Jason, right? Like a lot of the people that we would think are psychopaths from the media are not. A lot of people we would never think are psychopaths are, like Ferris Bueller. I was actually at Penn studying psychopathy for a summer in like their criminology department. And one of the things the guy taught me was like, okay, we're going to sit down, we're going to watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and we're going to score him in the psychopathy checklist revised. And like, do you think he's going to be a psychopath? And I was just like, no, like Ferris, come on, that's my boy. Like, no, of course he's not a psychopath. Oh my God, Joan, yes. Like up here on the checklist. So all that is a very long roundabout way to say that like I definitely like thinking about kind of like the way that different mental traits or like psychological traits and characteristics can present differently in different people and how the same diagnosis or the same like personality type can look pretty different depending on somebody's background or what parts of that they're choosing to show when like during the story.
I love that. I mean, like I feel like, yeah, with like psychopaths, like I love that you mentioned Hannibal Lecter because I feel like a lot, like when you think about psychopaths, like you think about how the media and especially Hollywood has like portrayed them, right? And it's, yeah, usually it's like the serial killer who's like super cold blooded and like you just know like, oh, they're like a psychopath. And I feel like a lot of times, even in everyday conversation, we can be like, oh, like that person's like a psychopath, right? As like just a derogatory term, when in reality, like it really is like anything else. There's like a spectrum, and like if you look at the research, like a lot of doctors and like CEOs and just people are psychopaths and like you would never know, right? So I loved that aspect of your book because I think I'm not going to spoil anything, but I love that like you kind of think like, oh, maybe this person's a psychopath when you're like reading it, but then you realize later on that like again, like everyone kind of like you might not even realize it that you have those traits within yourself, and therefore like it might be hidden like in your interactions and even in how you perceive yourself. But then as you like go down the book, you realize like, oh, maybe I am like I have some aspects of psychopathy. So I absolutely love that.
Oh yeah, like I think that, you know, psychopathy is like a diagnosis, right? Where like you have to have like a certain like level of traits to be like a psychopath. But so many people have like different levels of that. And like, okay, so here's for context, to be a non-psychopath on this checklist, you have to have fewer than, I don't remember if it's like 6 or 8 points, but it's really low. And to be a psychopath, you have to have over 30 out of 40. So like, what about all of the people that are between like 8 and 30, right?
Yeah. What if you're like 29, right? Like,
right. Like,
it's-
are you not a psychopath now? Right.
Yeah.
And so like I love exploring how like there's this, like a lot of people probably do have some of these traits the same way that people can have all kinds of different traits, right? And it's only like in certain situations that they become more obvious, or like when you reach a critical mass of them. And like, yeah, so that was fun to play with, is like this idea of like the subclinical psychopath.
I guess while we're on this topic, would you mind telling us what the psychopathic traits are? I think we just had
So psychopathy has like 2 different aspects to it. So it has the like, you have to be callous and emotional. So this is like the traits that have to do with emotion. Typically, and again, a psychopath doesn't have to have all of these, but a psychopath will usually have most of them, because it's very hard to like hit the clinical threshold on this scale, and it's hard on purpose because it's a very serious diagnosis, right? But they will have limited to no empathy for others, at least like intentional empathy. There's some evidence to show that like, I mean, automatic empathy. There's some evidence to show they can like make themselves feel empathy if they want to. They just don't have the motivation to do that. So they simply don't, like 90 times out of 10, unless it's going to be like instrumentally beneficial for them. That's another thing. They do tend to think about things instrumentally. So like when they do engage in aggression, it tends to be instrumental rather than reactive. It's not like, you know, somebody hits you, you hit them back. It's more like somebody hits you, you're like, how am I going to get them back? Let's see. I don't want to hit them because that might get me in trouble. So instead I'm going to do, right?
Yeah.
So there's like an instrumentality to it, or like I'm going to hit them so that I can get this from them. There's also impulsivity is one of the diagnostic traits. So that's part of why I say like Hannibal Lecter is not a good example of a psychopath, because we don't ever really see him do anything impulsive. Like he never like loses his temper and lashes out. Like he never like decides to drink a lot compulsively, or like do drugs or have promiscuous sex. Like he doesn't like kind of act out in these externalizing impulsive ways. So that's one thing too. There's also like, there's several other traits in there too. And there's like a behavioral section, which is like they have to have engaged in things that would qualify them to have received a diagnosis of conduct disorder in childhood. So basically what this means is like these traits have to have been present since they were a small child. They have to have been doing things as a child before they got like a little bit more self-control that like were illegal or harming others, whether it's like animals or people. They have to have repeatedly gotten in trouble. So like, you know, it's hard, not impossible, but hard to get the diagnosis of a psychopath as an adult if, you know, you've never like gotten expelled or suspended or like arrested or had some kind of run-in with the law, because again, a serious diagnosis, the bar is like up here.
Yeah.
Or like they have to engage in parasitic behaviors and relationships with others. So like they would see others as like only being useful to them. And like I said, like about the psychopath who sits in his mom's basement and like only plays video games all day and doesn't like get a job or contribute to the family and just snaps at his mom every time she comes in to tell him to stop, right? Like it doesn't have to be that they're parasitic, like, and that they want to become a big like hotshot lawyer and they'll climb over anyone to get there. It can be as simple as like, I want that sandwich, I'm going to take that sandwich. Or I'm going to make that person feel I'm going to manipulate them into giving me that sandwich because I want it. So that like manipulativeness. And there's not as much anymore, but there did used to be like a requirement that they had to have had like been arrested or had like relationships end. Now it's like not as required, but it's more like you get higher points on the scale if like you've had multiple like relationships end badly, or like you've been abusive, or like you've been arrested. So yeah, all these things, like it's a point-based thing. You're just getting points for how badly you display each of these traits, and if you get high enough, then you're a psychopath.
Yeah, and I'm sure like if you don't like get high enough, like you can have a lot of these traits and probably be considered like a high functioning psychopath and kind of just like, you know, move through society and be fine.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing is like people who are really high on this, like the stereotype of a psychopath is like that they're super competent, but the average IQ of a psychopath is lower than average, like the typical IQ. And like the typical psychopath is getting caught and is going to prison. It's unusual for that not to happen because impulsivity is one of the diagnostic criteria. Like they're not like structuring their behaviors in a way that's going to let them get away with it most of the time, unless they're like, you know, a super outlier and like they happen to be really smart. They happen to be like able to moderate that impulsivity, or their impulsivity is like not as severe as somebody else's.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. Like, you don't just write like a character based by like the diagnostic handbook, because I think like you introduce a lot of nuance. I'm not going to like say like who the psychopath is necessarily or whatever, but I think like you just do a great job of like enticing the reader to like look up on these facts, but also like, again, like introducing the fact that there is nuance and someone might not like qualify for like the, you know, diagnostic label because they might not have enough of those points, but they might have enough of those points to like, you know, like act in certain ways that would be considered psychopathic by other people. Yeah. Which I guess, it brings me to my next question, which is that I love the character arcs in your book, because I feel like a lot of times, especially in young adult, we think a lot of like character arcs as like growth or character like overcoming or like changing in some big drastic way. But I love that in your book, I really felt like the journey was one of kind of just realizing who you are and becoming who you are and just like owning up to that. And I was wondering if that's kind of like how you intend to write the character arc, or if like you did want to portray something where like a character is changing a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that Felicity's arc throughout the book, a lot of it is like, it's not so much that she's changing and becoming a different person as it is that she's like becoming comfortable with herself and like starting to accept herself as she is in this moment, and like stop trying to like fit herself into some other box, right? And like this is happening on like multiple levels. It's happening with like her feelings about her relationships with other people. It's happening about her attitude towards magic and towards academia. It's happening with her attitude towards being lesbian. Like it's not that she's realizing she's lesbian or that she's discovering magic or she's like changing the way that she connects with other people. Is that like she's starting to see more of the texture of it and like stop holding herself to like the maybe unrealistic standards that she used to be holding herself to anymore.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned. Yeah, I love that you mentioned like it's not like she knows all these aspects of herself. It's not like she's like discovering anything. It's more like she's just like not necessarily I guess worrying too much about like how the outside like is perceiving her, right? And yeah, I love that, just because I feel like in young adult, like I love when we have more of these like self-acceptance journeys and not necessarily this drastic change. But yeah, I love Felicity's character. I mean, I feel like everyone's gonna love Ellis because Ellis is just like so cool. Like everyone wants to be Ellis, but Felicity really drew me in because I just remember there's a scene in the beginning where like she's just talking about like how she looks and like her lipstick and how it's like smudged, and then there's like a mirror scene at the end where she's like, oh, like my lipstick isn't smudged. Like it's just that little detail where I'm like, okay, like Felicity has like accepted like exactly who she is. That was awesome.
Yeah, I mean, she was my favorite. I mean, well, Ellis was fun to write because she just like chews the scenery, right? Like,
yeah,
she's in a scene, she's just gonna like devour it. But like, Felicity was so interesting and fun to write, just from a character development perspective, and like thinking about like the things that she's in denial about and the things that she isn't, and like how that changes over the course of the book.
Yeah. I think Alice is like the kind of character, kind of reminds me of like C from like my book, The Ones We're Meant to Find, where like you kind of know she's gonna steal the scene, she's gonna be like a crowd pleaser, you know, like who doesn't like love those kinds of like bigger than life sort of characters. But I really have a soft spot for the characters who in the beginning they might seem like more subdued or kind of more like the wallflower, but then like later on you realize they're actually like so much more than that.
Yeah, like writing Felicity at the beginning, I remember being like, you know, she she has like a little bit of like Bella Swan like ness to her at the start of the book, where she's like, oh, she's kind of like soft edged, bland, like you could project a lot of things onto her, and then like as the book goes on, you start realizing that's not the case.
Yeah, and I love that it's like shown to be not the case depending on like the situations that she's in, right? Because I think some people, like, it's easier to be like bland or whatever when you're just in like an everyday normal situation, right, where her peers would also be in. But later on in the book, she really gets thrust into these like really drastic situations, like high pressure ones, and I think it's how people act in those situations that really tells the most about character. So I love that she's like that way. I love Felicity. I did want to ask you, because like so much of the book is about like method writing, and can you like write something that you haven't experienced? And in Ellis's case, like, she can't, right? Like, I mean, she chooses not to. She wants to experience everything she writes, which, by the way, guys, leads to some really incredible twisty happenings. But I absolutely loved some of like the short mountain climbing scenes in your book. They actually remind me of like, I'm like a huge fan, like, even though I can't rock climb at all, but I love movies like Everest and the book Into Thin Air, and those like scenes really like, they were so evocative. They made me think of that. So I wanted to ask you, like, are you like into climbing? Like, how did you kind of write those scenes in such a way that they really feel real?
Yeah. So I do like to climb. I wouldn't say I'm like a climber. Like, I don't have my own shoes or anything. I mean, I live in New York City, right? But like, I do like to go to like the climbing gym, and then my parents live in Colorado right now, and so my sister lived there before they even moved there, so I would often go out there to visit my family. And you know, my dad's a climber, like he's very into that, and so you know, he taught me some, and we would go climbing. But my mom's also an avid hiker, so we're just a lot of outdoors stuff growing up, and like even more so, you know, as a young adult. And so I think that I drew a lot of it from that. Like, I obviously was not climbing at the level that Alex was. Like, Alex was like an Olympic sport climber. Like, you know, clearly I'm not going to be out here like on the east face of Long's Peak, right? But I could probably walk up some of it. So
that's better than me. I don't trust myself on heights.
Yeah.
But it's good to know that you don't need, you're not Ellis in your writing. You don't necessarily need to experience the thing to be right about. I mean, I just loved it, because I remember you shared like a snippet of actually one of the first pages of the book, which was the climbing scene, and it just drew me in instantly. I love that aspect.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite scenes to write. And like at one point my editor wanted me to cut it, and I was like, no. Imagine if this book just started on chapter 1. Like, no, that's not going to work.
I love that you managed to keep it. I feel like so much of revising is trying to like figure out how to keep like the things that you love.
Well, and like explain like why they are necessary, and then figure out like why didn't it seem like it wasn't necessary, because it is. So like maybe there's something else I need to fix to make it more clear why it had to be there.
Yeah, which makes me curious, actually. This isn't a question I had planned, but like, what was the revision process for this book like? Because like when I read it, it felt super like assured. I'm like, oh my God, this probably just came out of Victoria's brain, like already formed.
No, so I mean, actually, like, you know, you would think that the witches are like a major part of this book, but when I first wrote it, it was maybe half as long. It was a super bare bones draft, and there were no witches at all. Like the Dalloway Five didn't exist. Like,
wow.
Wasn't even into magic. Like, none of that was there. It was just like the method writing storyline. And I read that, and I sent that to Victoria Schwab, actually, and I was like, so something's wrong with this. Like, what's wrong with it? She's like, you just need more. Like, you need another plot line. Like, you need another like major through line. And I wrote back, and I was like, you know, what if they were like witches? What if they were like witches at the school previously, and there's this whole mystery about like how they died, and so it all ties together, and like Ellis is writing about it, and she was like, yeah, that's it. So and I went and just added all that back in, and that all happened before it, you know, sold to the publisher. So the time that it went out to publishers, it had that storyline. And then doing the revisions with my publisher, a lot of that was like smoothing those together more, so that like the witch storyline was more integrated with the rest of the book, because I think at the time that I sold it, it felt like what it was, right? Which was like, here's one storyline, and then here's my B plot that I just added in to make the book longer. Whereas it needed to be like much more inherently part of the story. And like, it was one of those things that I think I said in a different event once, that I'm honestly like flabbergasted that it wasn't part of my original idea, because it is so in sync with like the main themes of the book and like the main things that I'm trying to say. And like, so the fact that it like immediately, when Victoria was like, oh, it needs a B plot, and I was like, I know, like tells me that on some level I must have intuited that that was important, or that that like was the direction to go. Because now, like on the other end of it, looking back, I don't know. I don't know if this happens to you when you're writing. If you're ever like adding something major, like a scene or a character or a twist in a book, and you're like, literally, why was I so dumb that I didn't put this in from the start? Because this is like necessary. This like the whole story hinges on this, and for some reason I didn't see that before now.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, to some extent. I think I'm like kind of that person who like the weird writer like really loves drafting and hates revising. So there is a part of me that kind of like stubbornly holds on to like the original. So like it takes me a while to actually come to the conclusion that like, oh yeah, like this revision, like this idea, like what it was always supposed to be a part of it. But yeah, like in the ones we're meant to find, like I guess for me, like what changed the most was Casey's storyline. Like a lot of the mystery in the beginning of Casey's storyline didn't actually exist with the start of from the first draft. Like Casey kind of knew everything that went on with what happened to Celia, and now like looking back, I'm like, okay, like that doesn't make sense. Like why did she just like know everything from the start? So yeah, but I think that's so incredible, because like everything that you said like is made sense to me, because like as a writer kind of reading the book, I was like, okay, like there has to be something behind like the witches. Like it can't just be about magic. But then as a reader, I was like, it makes so much sense, because like Felicity and her relationship with magic, and kind of how it introduces like this uncertainty into the book, along with just like, is what she's perceiving real? Is what she's perceiving just a product of like mental illness, etc.? Like I feel like that was such an integral part of her character that I can't really imagine the book now without that element.
I know, like I kind of want to go and reread my rough draft and like see how terrible it is, because I mean, I think this is part of why like one of my favorite pieces of writing advice to tell people is that writing is rewriting. And part of why I say that is because I think that there's this like idea that the first draft you write is going to have the most important stuff in the book. Like even if it's not like perfect, that it'll have like all of the important elements and all the important characters, and it will be like recognizable as the final copy. And like for neither this book nor for like The Fever King was that true. Like the original thing I wrote for both of them bears little to no resemblance to the final project. And I feel like sometimes, you know, you worry when you say something like, oh, well, I added this major plot element like later in the process, that people be like, oh, like why didn't you like include that? Well, then you weren't planning to write the book that you wrote. And like I don't think that that's true at all, because I think that that's like such an important part of the writing process. And if you were to cut out the revision, no book would be, one, like good, or two, like the way that it's supposed to be. Because you discover what a book's supposed to be through the process of drafting it, but also through the process of revising it and like reading it over again, and like seeing those holes and getting other people to see those holes. And you know, the final form of the book, or like the truest soul of the book, is not always like that initial germ of an idea you have. Sometimes the soul of the book is what you discover as you're working on it.
Yeah. And I find that when you find like a solution, or even like just like a really big change for the book, oftentimes you will realize that even if it's like a huge difference from the initial draft sometimes will have that like innate built-in room and like the built-in sort of just context for this solution to fit right in, right? So it's like you just discovered it a bit later, but it was always meant to be like in the original, just based on how it was set up.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, I don't know. I think that that's one of the reasons that Kill Your Darlings is also good advice, is because like if you're clinging to the very initial idea you had, then you might not be open to these kinds of revisions, because you're like, but that'll change the book. That'll make it a really different book. Yeah, but sometimes it needs to be. Sometimes it needs to be a totally different book. And like you have to let go of this initial plan that you had to go in a different and better direction.
Yeah. Though sometimes you have to try to keep like little bits of your darlings. Like
yes.
Yeah.
Like that first
just
scene.
in a different way. In a different way. You can just yeah. I tend to, as I'm like cutting things of a book, I paste them into like a different document just in case they like come back. Yeah.
I'm always like, oh, I might like cannibalize that later. Have I ever done that? No, I have never gone back and used them. But like, they're there.
It's just helpful. It makes it easier to cut if you know it's like it's still there, like in just a different document. Yeah, so I want to ask some of like the fun questions now. Now that I've like milked your brain of like all the psych and character development and revisions, which honestly, like when I talk about a revision process, I get like war memories because I'm like, oh no, like the stress just comes back. I really want to talk about your cover because I love covers. I joke a lot that like one of the reasons why I like write is to get a cover, at least like my write to get traditionally published, because it's just so fun to see like how your book is going to end up being packaged. And I love this cover because I think it gave me like kind of Ninth House vibes with like the typography and the font like really front and center. And yeah, like I love the flower details, and I am actually kind of scared of flowers. So originally I was like, when I saw this cover, I got kind of heebie-jeebies because I was like, oh, like wilted flowers. Yeah, which is, I mean, it was perfect, right? I mean, I just get scared of them because I really don't like dots. So like seeing like the stamens like gives me like just heebie-jeebie feelings. But if you've read the book, then you'll know that this flower is like super significant in the book. So I just wanted to ask you like what the cover process was like, and if you had like input on how this beautiful book ended up being.
Yeah, so originally the cover was super different. Like it was a much less crossover, much more YA cover. It was like a photograph of like a girl's head, like the head this girl trope, right? Where it like started at like here, and it was like here down, and she was like blonde, and like she had a necklace that had like a pentacle on it, and then she had like this big black widow spider that was like on her neck.
Oh my god!
It was gorgeous, but I was also like, people are gonna be so afraid of that spider. And so then we like tried it with a moth, and then the moth looked like so gross, and like it's like a death's head moth, and that was actually terrifying too. And I was finally like, I guess it's gonna be like the spider. I mean, hopefully just people won't be scared. And then like out of nowhere they came back and they were like, actually want to go a different, more adult direction with the cover. And so they showed me this, and they also showed me a version of it that had like a lavender background. And yeah, I was obsessed with this, and with like the black background. I love just like how the hellebore flowers like are only slightly differently colored, than like the background. So I remember describing it to my editor. I was like, imagine you're Barnes & Noble and you're walking up and you see the book and it looks black, and like as you approach, like the flowers emerge, and yeah, it just looks so good. The cover artist is called Maggie Imperios, and she did an incredible job.
I really love it because I think like a lot of like young adult is like trying to do something that is familiar but in a different and unique way. And I loved how you just described the flowers, because I feel like we see like flower covers, but like yours is just so striking because like you said, it is so integrated into the background, but it's also so striking once you realize not only how beautifully they're rendered and painted, but also like their significance to the story itself. Yeah, I love your cover, and I absolutely love the UK cover. Having read the book, I'm like, the UK cover is just full of like Easter eggs for like the little details, from the skull to like the books to like just like the bust. Like everything is so perfect. So guys, if you haven't checked it out yet, Victoria's UK cover from Titan Books, it was just dropped yesterday. I think you should definitely check it out, and also pick up a UK copy. Pre-order it now. Okay, so I have another fun question, which is, I love that your Fever Wake series got adapted to like webtoon, because that's so fun. Like just like having that visual medium to like tell your story. I guess for like A Lesson in Vengeance, like what kind of adaptation would you hope for in your dreams?
I would love to see this as like a film or a TV show. Like I feel like it's easier to think of it maybe as a film, but I actually think it would be a good show, because I think you could really like tease out more of like the Dalloway Fives history. If you had like a full season to explore it and like look at I don't know, just like really dig into like the school politics and to like Felicity's relationship with her mom and stuff like that across a show. And then also because like there could be a season 2 that could be like either like Ella's backstory, or it could like be Felicity, you know, when she's last since she's gone to college, because I feel like the epilogue really like opens up some questions about like Felicity's life after the end of the book, and that could also be cool in a TV show format. So I would love to see it as a show. But again, a large part of that is also because I want to see Anya Taylor-Joy play Felicity.
Oh my god, I would love it as a show. I'm thinking like Big Little Lies right now. Like I think just a show like that would be perfect for like an episodic show. And yeah, I love that you mentioned Felicity's mom, because I love the amount of mom that was in there. Like it was just like enough to kind of like give depth to the character and tease you, you know, about this like other side of Felicity. But I think it definitely could be something that would be like expanded in a show. I love to see like who they cast as like the mom, like in her like just like her outfits. I mean, I love the outfits of everyone in this book. Like I feel like so much thought went into like how like the fashion, like the styles kind of like and like supplement the character. But yeah, I would love to see Felicity's mom. I love that you mentioned
Britton.
What?
Maybe Connie Britton.
Oh my god, yeah, that would be her.
In Horror Story Murder House.
I have not seen that, but
okay. But yeah, she would be good for it.
I love that you mentioned the epilogue, because I want to talk about that because like it's so hard not to like spoil it. But I mean, I love epilogues. I have had an epilogue in like both my debut and the ones we're to find, because I just love like writing like what kind of happens after the book, but in a way that is kind of troll and doesn't necessarily like, you know, like readers get to the epilogue and they'll be like, oh, like now I can get all the answers. But then in reality, the epilogue kind of just like raises more questions. I love that aspect of this book, because I think in the epilogue, like just seeing like who Felicity is and how she is like after all these years, it gives some closure, but at the same time, like you mentioned, it like opens the door and kind of like a, God, what's that Netflix show called again? You? It kind of gave me You vibes. So I was wondering, like, did you love writing the epilogue, and would you ever write more?
Yeah, so like originally the story ended very differently, and it didn't really leave open questions. Like it did, but it didn't like make you wonder about like what happened next, right? Like it felt like a very definite like door shutting. But I liked this revised epilogue so much more, because I feel like it opened up new questions about like Felicity's motivations throughout the whole book. But it also like, one of my favorite things to do, kind of like you with the epilogues, is like to be a little bit of a troll with them. Like I don't really want them to like make the reader feel better or make the reader feel like, now I'm satisfied.
Yeah.
I want the reader to read it and be like, wait, no, that's not what I wanted. Now I have to go and write fan fiction, because like
Exactly.
I'm gonna go and like have that same urge of like, this was great, what came next? I have to go think about that now. I have to go create like the sequel or create the prequel, instead of like, feeling as if it stands on its own. I mean, it should stand on its own enough that like your publisher will let you publish it that way. But like I think a little bit of open-endedness is fun.
Yeah, which I mean, I think that was like when I asked that question, I was like, oh god, because like I get asked this question a lot, where like, oh, are you gonna write like another book? And I'm like, no, because like that's on you, right? Like you're supposed to go write like the fan fiction if you actually want the closure. Which, by the way, I saw like you got, which is honestly like a career peak. Like guys, go read the Fear Rake fan fiction that Victoria has, because that's so cool that like readers are making it their own and like continuing the lives of your.
I know, I love it. There's like 62 of them. It's crazy.
Oh my god, that's just wow.
Somebody like wrote to me on Tumblr the other day. It's like, are we gonna get more Ames and Bethany content? And I'm like, listen, guys, like, welcome to fandom. I'll be your tour guide. You go do it. Go do it.
And now you guys can suffer in the writing, and I'll just like, that's so fun. All right, I think, we have some questions if you want to open up.
So if you do have any questions, be sure to put them in the Ask a Question function. We have a couple from Mike. Mike asked, you both write unflinchingly realistic characters. How much of yourselves do you put into your characters?
So for me, there's definitely a little bit of myself in all of my characters, even the ones I wish there wasn't any of me in. But I definitely think that there are some characters that are like have more of me in them than others. Like my partner used to always say, like, well, no, Malvero would never do this because Victoria would never do this. And like, although Gnome's definitely not like, especially like after a bunch of revision, like really that much like me, there's still like this strong through line. I feel like in a lot of characters of like, oh, this character's internal dialogue is written in the same voice as my internal dialogue, or this character's attitude towards relationships is the same as my attitude toward relationships, or this character's backstory is the same as my backstory. Like each character has like their thing. I feel like that I put of myself in them, but none of them are like just me, and some of them have more than others, and they all kind of take on their own life ultimately.
Yeah, I think I'm probably the same in that, like, I wouldn't say like any character is like totally like me, but I feel like at least each main character, point of view character, contains at least like one aspect of me that I at least understand deeply enough that I can write it in like a way that feels genuine. So like, for example, in Descendant of the Crane, like I think the relationship that Hasina has with her like dad, or also just like people who she respects, is something that was kind of for me. And then in the Ones Who Weren't Defined, even though I always say like C is nothing like me, she's like such an extrovert, I think her just determination is something that comes from me. And then in Casey, who is more like me in that she's like an introvert, she's still super different from me because like I am not as like logical or like just, I guess like I feel things. I have way less chill than Casey, but in her like social awkwardness and her like inability to kind of think of like the right thing to say and her constant worry of like how is she being perceived by the people around her, that's something that is kind of drawn for me. So I would say, yeah, like every character has like at least one thing that I kind of use for myself, but no one is like actually like me.
That makes sense. All right. Mike also asked, how did your I can't speak today. How did your editor help shape the story?
You want to go first, Joan?
Okay. Sure. Okay. So in the case of the Ones Who Weren't Defined, my editor was like, all right, like, because it's 2 point of views, right? And like one of the point of views, again, like C's was kind of one that I guess is more standard to young adult in that like she's this very emotionally immediate character. She has like a lot of guts and like grit, and it's just like fun to write about. So my editor was like, she's basically there, but Casey, we need to work on. And I guess in the case of Casey's storyline, even when I was drafting it, I kind of like had watered her down and like diluted her because I knew like fundamentally that she wasn't necessarily the material that, at least when I was reading young adult as a teen, like she wasn't the kind of character you would see. Like she's very subdued. She's very just understated. She's very just not like, even like though she's intelligent, she's just not intelligent in such a way that I had read young adult characters being portrayed, where sometimes like they use their intelligence being witty or just like whip smart or kind of like sarcastic and funny. She wasn't like any of those traits. So I watered her down, but my editor kind of called me out on that and was like, Casey like feels like the story just isn't there. And my editor made me dig deep and realize that I needed to kind of both beef up Casey's character and make her more true to who she was, and also introduce more story to her, and not necessarily be insecure or worried that readers might not want to read about her story and just want to read about C. So definitely my editor kind of helped me make Casey's story stand just as much as C's story.
Yeah, I feel like editors are really good at just like sussing out the parts of the book that aren't as strong as like other parts, and like that stand out for being weaker because the other parts maybe are so strong, and like really help you bolster them. Like for me, it was like I said earlier, like integrating the witchcraft plotline, but also like without spoiling, how to say this, like the whole thing with like Alex and like what happened to Alex originally was different. See, I can't say it because I'm gonna spoil it. But like basically, this was one of the situations where my editor made a suggestion about like, well, what if you did this? And I was like, no, because I need to keep this darling, and like couldn't explain like why I needed it, and I knew it was more than just like, oh well, I just like this scene or I just like this part and I want to keep it. I mean, that was certainly part of it, but there was also like a part of me that just viscerally was like, no, like that's not it. That's not the solution. And so I had to think about like, okay, what's like ultimately the problem? Like, why does my editor not like this thing that happens in Alex's backstory? And how can I solve that in a way that doesn't make me just like reflexively like cringe? So stuff like that. And like I said, like I kind of changed like the epilogue, and you know, she helped me pull out a lot of the themes more clearly. There's this whole bit in the middle when like Quinn, Ellis's sibling, comes to visit, that like originally was like a trip to Savannah that felt very out of place in like the rest of the book. And like originally like my editor had thought like, well, there's no purpose to any of this, like none of these scenes like do anything for the story, you should just cut them all together. And like another one of the situations where I was like, no, they are doing something, it just clearly isn't coming through, like it isn't actually working. So I had to like retool that whole section so that it became more obvious like what I was trying to say about the characters through that.
I love that you like kept them, because like I was like, no, like I love that section where Quinn was like telling Felicity like things about Ellis's backstory. And I think a lot of times like, yeah, like you said, like sometimes it can get like editor suggestions to be like cringe, right? But it really is about like figuring out, okay, like maybe the solution isn't to cut it entirely, but to make what's supposed to do more obvious, right? And like make it work.
That's what we had with the sex scene too, because like my editor kept like wanting to trim it back and saying it's too explicit, and like I kept being like, okay, and like cutting it back. And then we got to a point where like she wanted me to keep cutting it. I was like, I can't cut it and make it less explicit for like several reasons at this point. Like one, because like it's already like not more explicit than like straight sex scenes. They're women. And two, like this scene is doing something so important for the characters. So instead I was like, actually, I'm going to make it longer. Like I ended up adding to it, even though she was trying to get me to make it shorter. I made it a lot longer, but in doing so, added like a lot more about like Felicity's internal state and like how she was changing her perception of Ellis and of their relationship during the sex scene. And like it ended up coming across as less explicit for that. Like it came across as less like, I don't know, less like R-rated and more like PG-13, because like the focus shifted to the things that the focus was supposed to have been on in the first place, and I just wasn't doing a good job of like highlighting that.
Yeah, that's so funny, because like I didn't, when I read that scene, I was like, this isn't like R-rated at all. Like I think it did exactly what you had then retooled it to be, which is like really explore just like the characters during that scene. So yeah, I think it's funny because like I have a lot of author friends who like when they get their notes, they're like, oh no, like my editor asked me to cut this element that I really liked, but then like they end up like trying to find ways to like, you know, keep it. And I feel like sometimes that solution, like the one that you're actually able to take ownership of and be like, yes, like I'm addressing both the issue, but I also get to keep my darling. Like I think those solutions are oftentimes the strongest.
That's why I love working with my editor. I feel like she'll give like suggestions, but like I would say a solid 75% of the time I'm like, well, not that. That's not it. And like, but she's always like, okay, well, like here's the main problem. Here's like the thing we have to solve. Like however you want to solve that problem is fine.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be what I suggested, but like the problem needs to be solved. And then it's a matter of like, okay, well, how do I solve the problem in a way that's consistent with my vision for the book?
Yeah, it's always a discussion, which is nice. That's the best thing of the editorial process.
What we're really learning here is Victoria is very good at editing. All right. So Sophie asked, was the ending of A Lesson in Vengeance planned from the beginning, or did you end up changing things about it later in the writing/editing process?
So turn your volume off if you don't want to hear spoilers. And when I'm done with the spoilers, I'll give a double thumbs up. Okay, so basically, like, the epilogue was originally, like, totally different. So it used to be that it ended with Felicity went to the shop and she saw like Ellis's book, and she like freaked out when she saw the dedication, and she ran out, and it's like kind of implied that she might have gotten hit by a truck. And like it's not explicit, it's just like, you remember the like language of the first little scene, the mountain climbing scene? I just used that same language to like talk about like traffic, and like left it just kind of like opaque as to what happened. And so that's what I was saying earlier, like there was nowhere to go from there. Like you're not going to speculate about what happened to Felicity after, because it's like, did she even live? I don't know. But later I changed it to the thing with Talia, her new girlfriend, because I felt like that actually, like the original version was like edgy or whatever, but like it didn't tell you anything new about the characters. It didn't like do anything aside from like show what happened with like Ellis's book. And that like originally I was like, well, I just want them to know that Ellis's book was like about Felicity or like for Felicity. But it ended up like, yeah, it ended up going like way harder. And this was another thing that like kind of was my editor's doing, was she was just like, I don't know about like this ending. I feel like there needs to be like more going on. I feel like there just needs to be like a stronger, harder hitting ending. And I was like, oh, I know what should happen.
Wow. I mean, oh my God. I'm not going to spoil it. Wow. I'm just like, I mean, I love that too, because like you said, it's like edgier and whatever, but I also love like what you end up going with, because it does tell you something new about the character.
Yeah, I think it's way better. And again, that kind of like comes back to my earlier point about like, it's not that like your first draft is bad, or that it's like bad if your revised draft ends up going in a totally different direction. Because like sometimes that makes it better, and like that doesn't like diminish the book, it just progresses it.
Probably shouldn't have myself on mute. If you had a chance to give your younger writing self any advice, what would it be? And this is from Anna. So either of you can go first.
I feel like the one that I would most want to say to myself is to write like what you're passionate about and what you most want to write, which is something that like I figured out in stages. Like I used to write a lot of fanfic, and so of course I was writing whatever I wanted to write. But then like when I was writing The Fever King, which is my debut, I remember like I would have a lot of debates with my critique partner over like whether or not parts of the book were publishable. Like one of the main ones was like, is it publishable if everyone's gay? And like I was like, well, I just want to write a book where everyone's gay, and like because I would want to read a book where everyone's gay. My friend was like, it just reads like fan fiction. I was like, well, maybe I want to read my fan fiction and just let me live. So, you know, I just wrote the book the way I wanted to write it. And kind of the same thing with Lesson of Vengeance. I was like, there's a part of small voice in my head that's like, oh, like, is this like too pretentious? I'm like, no, vibes. Like, this is what the book is. Like, I want to write something that's extremely pretentious. That's like the most like hair-pullingly obnoxious characters in the world. And like, so like that's just what I want to do, and I'm not going to worry about like whether it's marketable, because I'm writing it for the person who, like me, wants to read something like this, or like would be in the mood to read something like this. And I think one thing that like ultimately helped me kind of put that together and have that be like my way of approaching what ideas to write was talking with my agents once, and like I had a list of ideas of things that I was like, what should I write next? Should I write this book, this book, this book? You know, what's marketable didn't play a role. They were like, well, don't write space opera. We can't sell space operas right now. Okay. But like, otherwise she was just like, well, okay, well, which one are you most excited about? Which one is like keeping you up at night? And I was like, this one. And she was like, all right, well then do that. Drop everything, do that. Like, that's it. You want the one that the reader will read it and they'll feel obsessed with the characters, because you're obsessed with the characters. And if you're not obsessed with the characters, then why should anybody else be? And so yeah, I definitely wish I could go and tell my younger self, like, anytime that I felt nervous or second guessed like why I was writing the book a certain way, or felt like there were a lot of books that I started writing that I then stopped because I was trying to like write to market, or I was trying to write something that would be like super commercial and sell, but it wasn't ultimately like the thing that scratched my own id. It's like, all right, I'm gonna stop trying to be some kind of like literary superstar, and I'm just gonna write like the trash that I want to read. And I wish I'd realized that sooner.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the same as what Victoria said, in the sense that I think when I started writing, I really was writing based on what I loved reading at the time. So like, for example, my first ever full-length original novel was like a young adult dystopian, right? Like heavily inspired by like the 2010 like Hunger Games, Diversion, etc. And so I would really was writing what I loved to read. But I guess like as like the more I've written, the more I've realized what I now write is what only I can write, right? Because like what I love to read can be much bigger than what I personally think that I bring something to the table, and something that's going to make it worth it for me to like read this book 20 times and like revise it on end. Especially because I'm like such a slow writer. I definitely think a lot like, okay, if I'm taking like 3-4 years to write this book, like, am I writing something that I really feel like I can only bring to the table, which is ultimately what made me make that change to write Descendant. Like originally Descendant of the Crane was like this half Roman, half Chinese world. And the only reason why I introduced like the Roman aspect was to like, again, dilute down the Chinese aspect to make it more marketable, to give it a better chance of selling. But that ended up being a disservice to the story. It kind of held me back from the world building and just the characters. And when I ended up rewriting the whole book from scratch in between rounds of submission, when it didn't sell in the first round, I was like, okay, like I'm just gonna go like full in Chinese world building, Chinese characters, Chinese names, etc. And that ended up working. At the same time, I don't want to say like it's easy to do that. Like I don't want to say that this industry is necessarily super welcoming when you do like go all in with what you want to write, especially as a marginalized author. Like I think there always is kind of that pushback that you receive when you write something that is so different from what is already out in the market. But again, like at least for me, like what makes it worthwhile is writing what I want to write. I guess the other advice I would give was just like to enjoy it, because I think it does get harder as you go down the road. Like I think when I was writing in the beginning, like as a teenager, I just had so much confidence in myself. I thought like everything I wrote was great. And now I'm like, I wish I could recapture that feeling, because now I think everything I write is bad. So just like enjoy the process, because if you believe in yourself and you don't give up, I think it will happen. But like the journey is just as important as the destination.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for joining us. And thanks everyone for watching. Just to wrap up a little bit, do you two want to say like any upcoming projects you might have, anything you might have going on, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I am getting edits next week on a book that's a YA like lesbian umbrella academy kind of vibe. Currently still untitled, which is why it's still unannounced. But hopefully we'll get to hear more about that soon. Also just kind of playing around with a couple other like secret projects. But you can find me on social media at So Said Victoria on like pretty much any platform.
I'm so excited to read your Umbrella Academy book.
It's so bad right now.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm sitting on several things, but I should have a Descendant of the Crane announcement coming soon. And I also am going to be returning to Chinese fantasy soon. I can't say more on that, but that is something else. And later tonight, I am going to be talking about my book on my Instagram, a spoiler edition chat. But yeah, that's all I'm working on.
That's so fun. All right, for the bookshop, we have our signing with Victoria Lee at 4 p.m. So if you live in the area, be sure to stop on by. You can order a signed copy if you don't live here and have Victoria personalize it down there in that link below. And at 5 p.m. today is Bookstore Romance Day. So we are having a panel of 7 different romance authors at 5 p.m. back here on the Scribecast. So be sure to check that out too. Yeah. So thank you both so much. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you about your book, Victoria.
Oh, I'm so glad you did this.
Perfect. All right. Bye, everyone.